The South China Sea is a ticking time bomb. China's aggressive expansion, US alliances, and razor-thin red lines have turned this vital trade corridor into the world's most dangerous flashpoint. One wrong move, a clash over a disputed reef, a misread radar signal, could unleash a full-scale war involving nuclear-armed superpowers. So what would happen if it all kicked off? Let's break down, hour by hour, how a South China Sea war could spiral into global chaos. And it all starts with a supply mission that doesn't go as planned. On day 1 at 0630 hours local time, BRP Teresa Magbanua departs Palawan with monthly supplies for Philippine Marines stationed aboard the BRP Sierra Madre, a grounded landing ship that acts as a forward post in the Spratly Islands for the Philippine Navy. The patrol vessel is crewed by 67 members of the Navy and only carries construction materials and provisions for the semi-operational Sierra Madre under the July 2024 provisional arrangement between Manila and Beijing. 3 Chinese Coast Guard vessels, CCG-5205, CCG-5901, and CCG-21555, shadow the Philippine ship from international waters. Roughly 2 hours later, as BRP Teresa Magbanua approaches the 18 nautical mile marker from the Sierra Madre, CCG-5901 executes an aggressive blocking maneuver. The 165-meter Chinese vessel closes to 15 meters and threatens the use of water cannons, a tactic that has already been used by China under the guise of avoiding collisions. However, the Philippine ship ignores it and moves forward and into the Chinese ship's trajectory. Both ships would need to maneuver frantically to avoid collision, something that is more difficult in heavy seas. So just before 0900 hours, CCG-5901's reinforced bow strikes Teresa Magbanua's port side, breaching the hull and killing 4 Philippine sailors instantly. Nearly immediately, the Philippine Navy headquarters in Manila receives distress signals. BRP Sierra Madre's Marines provide emergency assistance. Chinese vessels initially attempt or feign rescue operations, but are forced to withdraw after Philippine reinforcements are announced. The incident marks the first combat deaths in South China Sea disputes since the Johnson South Reef skirmish of 1988. At 10:30 hours, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. convenes the National Security Council. With 4 Filipino sailors dead and the Teresa Magbanua sinking, his previous statement that deaths would be considered as close to an act of war as possible provides opportunity and pressure for a military response. At 1200 hours, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth confirms that Article 4 of the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty applies to armed confrontations in the South China Sea. The USS Carl Vinson Carrier Strike Group, conducting operations in the South China Sea itself just over 400 miles southeast, heads toward Philippine waters. At 1400 hours, Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force places destroyer JS Sazanami on heightened alert in the Philippine Sea. Prime Minister Ishiba announces grave concern and readiness to support alliance partner the Philippines. Australia's HMAS Warramunga, on routine patrol near Palawan, requests permission to assist with search and rescue operations. Japan and Australia have practically become part of the conflict already. At 1630 hours, just 7 hours after initial contact, the PLA Navy deploys a Type 055 destroyer and a Type 052D destroyer from Hainan Naval Base towards 2nd Thomas Shoal. China's foreign ministry blames the collision on illegal Philippine activities, while President Xi Jinping convenes a Central Military Commission emergency session. An hour and a half later, at 1800 hours, 2 U.S. Navy destroyers, the USS Halsey and the USS John Finn, depart Subic Bay under EDCA arrangements, carrying Tomahawk cruise missiles and SM-6 interceptors. Meanwhile, F-35B Lightning II fighters from the Marine Rotational Force at Bassa Air Base conduct routine patrols 100 miles from the incident site. At 2000 hours, the UN Security Council calls an emergency session. Already, shipping rates have spiked and prices of goods have started ticking up, amid concerns over $3.4 trillion in annual trade through the South China Sea choke points, and this is only day 1. On day 2 at 0200 hours, NATO satellite reconnaissance shows Chinese military aircraft deploying to artificial islands. Fiery Cross Reef receives 12 J-11 fighters and 8 6K bombers, capable of carrying YJ-12 supersonic anti-ship missiles. Mischief Reef activates advanced radar systems and deploys HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles with a 124-mile engagement range. 2 hours later, the USS Carl Vinson Strike Group, including 2 accompanying destroyers, established patrol patterns 200 miles east of Scarborough Shoal. FA-18F Super Hornets conduct continuous combat air patrols while E-2D Hawkeye aircraft monitor Chinese military movements from artificial islands. At 0600 hours, Tokyo officially invokes collective self-defense provisions following consultation with Washington. JS Maya, an Aegis-equipped destroyer with advanced missile defense capabilities, departs for the Philippine Sea. F-35A fighters from Misawa Air Base begin extended-range patrols toward the Taiwan Strait. Approximately 2 hours after that, Vietnam deploys 2 Gepard-class frigates and Kilo-class submarines from Cam Ranh Bay, citing threats to the exclusive economic zone. Hanoi activates its Soviet-era S-300 air defense systems along its coastline and places its fighters on alert. This means any potential conflict is now threatening to spill over into the western portion of the sea. At 1000 hours, the Chinese Type 055 destroyer Nanchang starts conducting electronic surveillance of U.S. carrier operations. Communications between FA-18 aircraft and the USS Carl Vinson are periodically interrupted over the next half an hour. The incident demonstrates advanced Chinese electronic warfare capabilities developed since the December 2023 Growler incident. In response, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announces Australia will honour ANZUS treaty obligations. Diesel-electric submarine HMAS Collins, one of few operational boats in the fleet, deploys toward the South China Sea. Australia also starts putting its vessels on high alert. However, it is roughly 1500 hours on day 2 that we get the first actual military confrontation. Chinese Coast Guard vessel CCG 21555 aggressively approaches Philippine supply boats, attempting to reach BRP Sierra Madre survivors. The USS John Finn intervenes, positioning itself between Chinese and Philippine vessels. The standoff lasts 4 hours as both nations' military commands engage in crisis communication. Meanwhile, Chinese J-11 fighters from Fiery Cross Reef conduct routine patrols within 50 miles of US carrier aircraft. By the end of day 2, the Shanghai Composite Index drops and the stock market in Nikkei falls as investors flee from risk assets. Brent crude oil prices rise due to supply disruption fears. The political ramifications of multiple alliances and defense agreements finally coalesce on day 3, which is when we might see actual military engagement. The operations start on the US side as the USS Minnesota, a Virginia-class attack submarine operating from Guam, receives targeting data on Chinese naval formations. At the same time, the Chinese nuclear attack submarine Type 093 shadows the American carrier group. Both submarines maintain stealth while continuously tracking each other, playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse. At 0300 hours, Chinese DF-21D carrier killer ballistic missiles at Hainan installations are readied for deployment, threatening to fire on the gathered US and allied navies. To counter that, the USS Carl Vinson retreats 800 miles from the Chinese mainland to reduce targeting accuracy. But it's not China that makes the first offensive move. At 0500 hours, North Korea conducts yet another ballistic missile test, launching 2 KN-23 missiles toward the Sea of Japan. South Korea immediately raises its military alert status to Jindogai 2, the second highest level in its 3-phase readiness system, suspecting that North Korea is aligning itself with Chinese operations. This alert functions similarly to the American DEFCON system, signaling heightened military readiness. On the morning of day 3, PLA's Eastern Theater Command announces routine exercises in the Taiwan Strait, involving dozens of aircraft and several naval vessels. This is most likely a ruse to reposition its vessels closer to Taiwan and present an immediate threat to the small island. Taiwan's military readies its F-16V fighters and activates coastal missile defenses. At 0930 hours, Britain announces that the HMS Prince of Wales carrier strike group will deploy to the Indo-Pacific. France commits its Charles de Gaulle carrier group to the Indian Ocean. European involvement dramatically expands potential coalition size as the entirety of NATO is now alerted to a possible global war. On day 3 at 1100 hours, we see the first weapon launches as a Chinese maritime militia vessel rams into Philippine supply boats. Philippine Air Force FA-50 Golden Eagle fighters arrive on the scene, followed immediately by J-11 interceptors from Woody Island, which all open warning shots. At the same time, India responds to the rising instability in the region. The country's dependence on trade via the Malacca Strait prompts it to place its navy in the Indian Ocean or fortify Singapore alongside US forces stationed nearby. With this, the war now spans both the Pacific and Indian Oceans. China conducts the first direct offensive operations at 1400 hours as massive cyberattacks target the Philippines' telecommunications infrastructure, causing nationwide internet disruption. 2 hours later, YJ-21 anti-ship missiles on H-6K bombers and DF-27 intermediate-range missiles are readied for deployment by the PLA and are detected by US satellite warning systems. These weapons are practically impossible to counter through conventional means when they reach the full Mach 10 speeds. Simultaneously, Chinese Su-35 fighters accidentally lock onto the Japanese destroyer patrolling around Taiwan. Japan is forced to activate electronic countermeasures. US F-35C fighters are deployed from the USS Carl Vinson, arriving within minutes and forcing China to back off or fully commit to launching air-to-surface missiles before withdrawing. At 1900 hours, US Strategic Command is forced to raise the DEFCON level to 2, readying the US forces for inevitable conflict, as Chinese nuclear forces show heightened activity. US nuclear and ballistic missile submarines are deployed to the Pacific, while China's new DF-41 intercontinental ballistic missiles are constantly tracked for signs of launch. At 23:15 hours on day 3, a Chinese Type 055 destroyer fires warning shots at a Vietnamese frigate operating near the Paracel Islands. Vietnam responds by illuminating Chinese vessels with fire control radar and activating coastal anti-ship missile batteries. This marks the beginning of naval combat, with both sides exchanging fire but missing, likely on purpose to avoid an all-out war. After 72 hours, the crisis results in at least 4 confirmed deaths, roughly 24 injured personnel, and trillions in global market losses. Shipping insurance rates increase threefold, while oil prices surge due to major shipping lanes closing. The temporary closure of major ports in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shanghai creates supply chain disruptions affecting global manufacturing, and only a few shots have been fired. On day 4 at 0200 hours, President Xi Jinping authorizes the long-planned invasion of Taiwan. PLA's Eastern Theater Command launches the largest amphibious operation since D-Day, with over 100 of the Navy's ships and 400 attacking aircraft simultaneously. The timing exploits US carrier positioning 800 miles south of China, forcing it to trek toward the Taiwan Strait for the better part of the day. Taiwan's Swingfeng 3 anti-ship missiles destroy as many Chinese landing craft in the first wave as they can, but face overwhelming numbers. The island's F-16V fighters engage in massive air battles over the Taiwan Strait, but Chinese J-20 stealth fighters manage to achieve temporary air superiority. Taiwan immediately enacts its porcupine defenses, shutting off access to its major ports from the sea and deploying sea mines to prevent further incursions onto the island. The US is faced with an impossible choice. It can abandon its position in the Philippines to defend Taiwan, or fight on 2 fronts with insufficient forces, as most of its vessels are still en route. Strike Group 1 in the South China Sea eventually sets for Taiwan, while the US effectively declares war on China at 0400 hours. Tokyo invokes its self-defense operations as Chinese missiles are launched on US bases in Japan, the second largest concentration of US forces abroad after Germany. Kadena Air Base is barraged with DF-21C conventional missiles, while the PLA Navy submarines blockade Japanese and Taiwanese shipping lanes. Japan declares a state of emergency and authorizes offensive operations against Chinese territory. By 0800 hours, Chinese nuclear submarines show up on radar in the Philippine Sea and Taiwan Strait, forcing the US Strategic Command to enact DEFCON 1, as Russian nuclear forces also increase alert status in response. The situation reaches nuclear escalation thresholds not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. NATO consultations stop short of invoking Article 5, which applies to attacks on member territory in Europe or the North Atlantic north of the Tropic of Cancer. However, the alliance unanimously condemns the strike on US forces and affirms collective support. Major US allies begin deploying their navies in solidarity, while Britain and France ready their nuclear deterrents in response to Russia's escalatory posture. By late day 4, China declares a total exclusion zone around the South China Sea, threatening to sink any military vessel. The trade surrounding the sea practically stops. Taiwan is close to being fully blockaded, and US forces are deploying its navy to defend the island. In response, the Indian Navy destroyer INS Kolkata escorts commercial vessels through the Malacca Strait but faces pressure from the Chinese submarines in the area. A Type 093B nuclear submarine launches torpedoes on the Indian frigate INS Trikhand, killing 325 sailors. India declares war on China, and the BRICS economic alliance is in a shambles. With both sides of the Malacca Strait now facing imminent naval warfare, global shipping collapses, and oil prices start fluctuating as the largest importers and exporters of oil and gas are in active conflict. Tokyo, London, and New York stock exchanges suspend trading altogether as panic selling overwhelms systems. On the evening of day 4, Russia announces that it's joining China by providing intelligence and direct military support. Russia's Pacific Fleet encircles Japanese territory while Tu-95 bombers probe Alaskan airspace, directly compromising the US defense systems and forcing it to fight on multiple fronts. By midnight between days 4 and 5, Australia deploys the majority of its operational military to the area, including 6 Collins-class submarines, 3 Hobart-class destroyers, and 24 FA-18F fighters. North Korea launches more ballistic missiles toward Japan and South Korea, directly proclaiming its involvement as solidarity against oppressive regimes of the West. South Korea activates missile defenses while considering preemptive strikes on North Korean missile sites. Day 5 opens with yet another manufacturing and economic crisis. With the majority of global container shipping disrupted and Taiwan under siege, Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company facilities stop exports. Tech magnates like Apple, Samsung, and Tesla suspend global production as supply chains collapse. Emergency G7 summit convenes virtually. China starts attacking or pressuring other nations that have shores in the South China Sea, such as Brunei and Indonesia. At the same time, Chinese Belt and Road Initiative partners face pressure to choose sides. Djibouti closes port access to US forces, while Pakistan considers providing a nuclear submarine base for China. African nations with Chinese debt obligations face economic coercion to support Beijing's position. On the morning of Day 6, Britain, the US, and Australia coordinate Tomahawk cruise missile strikes on Chinese artificial islands. Chinese military installations suffer significant damage, but Chinese mobile missile launchers survive. Nuclear submarine HMS Astute sinks Chinese destroyer Kunming with Spearfish torpedoes. The Chinese aircraft carrier Liaoning battle group is deep in the Indian Ocean, threatening sea lanes in the Middle East. The Indian Navy responds by deploying BrahMos supersonic missiles from the Andaman Islands. The conflict's geographical range now covers over 6,000 miles of ocean. US GPS satellites are targeted by China's anti-satellite weapons, degrading precision-guided munitions globally. The United States retaliates by jamming the Chinese Baidu navigation system. Both countries are fully invested in cyber warfare to deter each other from conventional, ballistic, and nuclear attacks. The US Space Force actively monitors the Chinese airspace for deployment of orbital missiles pioneered in 2021. By week 2, China starts indiscriminately using its long-range weaponry to strike at Allied forces, with DF-27 hypersonic missiles hitting Guam's Andersen Air Force Base, destroying 8 B-52 bombers and killing 34 airmen. A bulk of its weaponry is rendered ineffective by ongoing cyber warfare programs. The US responds by targeting Chinese missile production facilities in the Hubei province with limited success, as China is already fully armed. The coordinated cyber attacks culminate in striking civilian operations and industrial facilities. Power grids across Taiwan, Japan, and the Philippines suffer outages, while US hackers target Chinese Three Gorges dam control systems. Global internet infrastructure degrades as China starts cutting seabed cables. By this time, all nuclear-capable countries have put their weapons on high alert and are waiting for anyone to make a move to plunge the war into a nuclear conflict. Week 2 ends with a global military conflict and a worldwide economic crisis hitting developing countries. To avoid using nuclear weaponry, China launches missile strikes on the Mediterranean in an effort to cut off NATO's navy from accessing the Suez Canal and reinforcing India's positions. Attacks on RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus officially trigger NATO's Article 5 for the first time since 9/11, as NATO declares war on China. Germany's newly refurbished military funding goes to providing logistical and economic support to the UK, France, the US, and all other countries that border Russia. Following China's lead, Russia militarizes the 1,600-mile border between itself and NATO. In the Middle East, Iran seizes the opportunity to attack Saudi Arabian oil wells and refineries. Persian Gulf shipping halts completely and the oil prices reach record highs. Africa and South America are caught in the crossfire. Brazil allies with the US and as part of BRICS is immediately threatened by China. African developing countries are pressured by Chinese covert operations as vital mines in Central Africa are destroyed, killing hundreds of workers. During week 3, the long-range warfare in the South China Sea reaches its peak as Taiwan is now fully blockaded. The US has deployed its entire navy and all allies launch their vessels in support. By this time, the war likely claims thousands of deaths and significantly more wounded as military and industrial installations are bombed with impunity. However, precision weapons might give way to attritional warfare, which escalates the death toll exponentially to the levels seen in the war in Ukraine during the second year of the conflict. By week 4, it's evident that the South China Sea war has two possible paths. The US and allied forces might eke out an operational advantage due to long-standing air superiority tactics. Otherwise, the war spreads far beyond the region and World War III begins. Russia, still suffering from the consequences of the war in Ukraine, is forced to retreat before NATO's invading forces. In desperation, President Vladimir Putin launches nuclear weapons at the US. The US, Britain, and France respond with nuclear weapons of their own. Israel, Pakistan, and Iran all deploy their nuclear arsenals. In case of a nuclear war across the Northern Hemisphere, estimates suggest long-term casualties of over 5 billion, more than half of the world's population. A 10-year prognosis includes a prolonged nuclear winter with widespread grain failures and famine. If China also hits Australia with nuclear weapons, Africa and South America are the only two continents that might have a chance of surviving. However, widespread economic collapse reverts them to underdeveloped countries. It's possible, however, that the world avoids a nuclear crisis if Russia stands down. China, surrounded on all sides, heavily outnumbered by NATO's armament, and with no large military allies on its own, is forced to approach peace talks from a losing position. Both sides enact a limited ceasefire. The further we go into the hypothetical war, the less accurate predictions become. This is due to the lack of verified details on national defense systems and capabilities, which naturally stem from every country attempting to hide military secrets. As such, it's futile to predict the outcome of the South China Sea War beyond the initial days without broadening the scope as much as possible. For reference, we can look at what happened in the war in Ukraine in February and March 2022. Russia firmly believed that the special military operation would be over in 3 days to 3 weeks. Instead, Ukraine managed to defend itself, giving NATO the confidence to provide donations and further its defensive measures. The war has been going for nearly 3.5 years compared to the initial projection of 3 weeks. A war in the South China Sea faces the same fog of war. China has a few different avenues of forcing military actions, whether through aggression against Taiwan and the Philippines or simply to prevent its own population from looking inward into the country's growing list of economic and demographic issues. But regardless of how it starts, it could end up being the deadliest, most widespread conflict the human race will ever see. Thanks for watching and subscribe for more analyses and predictions.